Having spent so many years in China, do you think you're making films about China, or is China making films about itself through your lens?
I never expected to spend this much time in China. I came to make one film, a film that you know, Better Angels. That was an extraordinary experience on two levels. First of all, I reacquainted myself with China. I'd come to China decades before China's kind of transformation. And when I came back to make Better Angels, the China that I saw had been transformed out of all recognition, and I was frankly stunned. But I was also very conscious, as I was making that film, that China was in trouble. I was living in the United States, where China was under attack every single week from this man in the White House who was using China as a whipping boy, as a political football, as a tool to create an existential enemy for the American people. As I was making the film, I knew I was in trouble. I knew that this film was going to have an enormous challenge finding an audience. And I was right. After we made that film, I was attacked, and the film was attacked. The film was very balanced. I was very careful. But we were attacked as being tools because we were saying good things about China. Not propaganda, just straight facts. And that made me so angry. So I decided at the end of that experience that it would be kind of responsible and valuable if I spent a few years in your country as an outsider, as a foreigner, looking at China and trying to kind of rectify that information deficit that existed, because people in the West don't understand China. So what I'm trying to do, without making propaganda for China, I just want to tell the truth, and perhaps I can change a few more people's minds.
And it takes being here to see it from a different perspective.
It does.
Now you're here, you're seeing from a different perspective, but you're also here to watch films, being the jury member of the Beijing International Film Festival, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the films that stood out for you the most from this year?
First of all, this experience was extremely rewarding. The people who were sharing the jury with me were super smart, and they were I learned a lot about China by listening to my fellow jury members' attitudes towards some of the films that we saw. What I can say is the process was fair, it was democratic. We saw films from all over the world, from strange countries that don't have a huge film industry, like Bolivia, like Finland, like Iraq, like Qatar. There were films there were some wonderful films from India. The French films were very, very much about small domestic subjects. The Indian films were very big, sprawling political epics. There was a lovely film from Finland, which was really an art house movie. And then from Bolivia, again, a very small film, about, like a three-person drama, a cheap, not expensive, extremely moving film. You know, it was like being a global tourist. For a week, I watched 16 movies. It was a kind of a global education. It was like getting on a lot of airplanes and traveling to a lot of places around the world and really understanding a little niche about particular countries. I had a fantastic time.
From your directorial debut, Myth Behind the Miracle to Guns, to A Day in the Death of America, to Better Angels. Your films have taken you to more than 80 countries around the world, and your subject matter is extremely diverse and dynamic. Yet, is there something that threads them together?
I always wanted to kind of explain the lives of others to people who were, well, like my tribe, you know, kind of Western European, liberal, intellectual, well-educated people. But they know nothing. When they travel, they go to safe places. They go to easy places on vacation. I wanted to go to hard places and really kind of analyze and look at and see the value in the lives of others. And that's what I'm doing in China. I'm making films about ordinary Chinese people, not special people, not rich people, not privileged people. I'm making films about how lives are being improved and values are being cherished, tradition is being respected in the last 30, 40 years, hundreds of millions of Chinese people have finally been able to dream about a better life. They haven't necessarily achieved it yet, but when you look at this initiative of the last few years, the Shaokang initiative, the poverty alleviation initiative, 100 million people being pulled out of poverty, 100 million people added to the Chinese workforce, 100 million people dreaming about a future. That's, to me, that's a magical thing. It's a magical achievement, and that's what I'm interested in.
Chinese films have really had very few successful close encounters with the sci-fi genre, whereas films about fantasy and mythology have done really well. They've become the staple at the Chinese box office, sort of. Do you think that this has to do with the Chinese culture's penchant for idealism as opposed to materialism? And do you think, what does it take for such a culture to produce great sci-fi films?
Because there's no tradition in China of science fiction. It's something which has been brought in from the outside. There are some very good Chinese science fiction writers. And of course, you know, the famous three-body problem, which is like the thing that everybody talks about all the time, has been taken by Netflix and is being produced in the West. I don't know, except that science fiction films tend to be more expensive. And so if the budget is higher, if you have, especially if it's a science fiction film which has a lot of effects, they're very difficult to make because they're quite expensive to produce. I don't think it means that China can't do it. I just think it's a stage in China's film development which isn't fully realized yet. But I don't think that's necessarily going to remain the same. I think young filmmakers, because young people generally are fascinated by science fiction, and they consume a lot of science fiction, whether it's in comics or whether it's in games and so forth. I think it's only a matter of time. You have some fantastic, super imaginative young filmmakers coming up. They need oxygen. They need some money. They need to be encouraged, and they need to be showcased.
They need an audience to
They need an audience, yeah, to see how good or bad they are. Because you can, you know, as a filmmaker, you live in your own imagination. The only time you ever know whether you're any good is when your film is playing in front of an audience.
And thank you very much, Malcolm.
My pleasure.
Thank you, I really appreciate it.
Okay.